and she will come with some guests. Thank you.
Well, I know how you feel. You're hungry and you want to go for a swim or a cold beer rather than listening to us. So we'll try to make that interesting for you. We have a consensus here is that we need to make journalism more visual. But the question is how, and what are the challenges that visual journalism is facing, and which storytelling tools we have to increase both its complexity and impact. This is a joint session with the Solutions Journalism Network, and which I represent in Europe since almost 3 years. And I have 3 great speakers here that I will not present because they project the bios on the screen, so I will save us time. So why would I moderate a panel on visual journalism if I'm, training in solutions journalism? Well, we think by being often too negative, photography can misrepresent the world we live in and report on. And we want to ask the question, what are the pics you're taking off? And we need to rethink the frame of our visual stories, because images have the power to highlight stories that aren't gaining enough traction and can amplify a diversity of perspectives. I might have to, thank you, the clicker. I might have to clarify what solutions journalism is and isn't. We were talking just before the session between us, and Santiago said, I'm not a fan of the term solutions journalism. Well, I'm not either. I think solutions journalism is rigorous reporting on responses to problems. So it could maybe be called responses journalism rather than solutions, because solutions suggest that you have the right solution. I don't think there is such a thing as a perfect solution. There are solutions with limits, and there are failures, and it's also interesting reporting on. So we've came out with 4 criteria to make sure your reporting on solutions is as balanced as any other topic you would cover. So covers a response to a problem and how it happened. The how is really important. Provides evidence of impact, looking at effectiveness, not just intention. Produces insights that can help others respond to, and points out limitation and caveats, and that might be the most important point. Why do we need solutions journalism? Because it can increase accountability. By showing what's working, you increase the pressure on the decision makers. It can increase benefits, and we have research showing that it can also increase engagement with your audience. Again, I want to point out what solutions journalism is not, because it's often misunderstood. It's not advocacy. You should not advocate for one solution rather than another. It's not hero story. Solution stories have characters, but not just one single hero, because it's more complex than one person. Not theories. It's something that is already happening. Not promotion and not fluff. We're not talking about positive news, but real investigative reporting on responses to problems. And really briefly, I want to tell you what Solutions Journalism Network is doing. So we are based in New York. We were created by Tina Rosenberg and David Botstein, both reporters for the New York Times, to come up with tools that could serve to journalists who wanted to report on solutions. So we give trainings to newsrooms, professional journalists. We develop tools to ensure that journalists are reporting on solutions with rigor. And we are currently working on a visual toolkit on how to report on solutions with a visual angle. And we also, so these visual toolkits will be ready by the end of July. And we're also launching a contest with the World Press Photo. It's a $50,000 grant for a few pieces to be published in the New York Times to develop best practices in solutions journalism in visuals, because we think we are still pioneering here. The best practices in solutions journalism and visuals are really rare. So that is why I'm here to moderate that panel. I will pass to Santiago, and maybe you can add your broad perspective as a, you have 30 years of experience, and you can tell us what the challenges visual journalism is facing today, and if you think we could consider solutions journalism as an answer.
Thank you, Nina. It's clear that visuals are increasingly important in journalism and have been for many years now through digital platforms and portable digital platforms in particular. People are looking at their smartphones all the time, and visuals are often a window into stories as well as a good way to explain stories. I think that's clear to everybody. The biggest challenge that I see in the journalism business, having been involved in it for more than 3 decades, is a cultural one, where people want to embrace visuals, but they don't really know how. And part of that stems from the hierarchy in most newsrooms around the world, where the text reporters tend to be at the top of the hierarchy, tend to dominate the conversations, tend to set the direction. And as well-intentioned as my colleagues in the text journalism world have been, I think that there is a large gap in understanding about how visual journalism works, from how it's created, to how it should be displayed, to the best way to engage with new audiences. And what I see happening is a lot of news organizations embracing photography on a sort of a standalone basis. And I think that that ship has to some degree sailed. And I think that photography in isolation, while it's useful and it's valuable, doesn't really do enough to address the appetites of today's modern news consumers. And I think there are tremendous opportunities that some news organizations are starting to embrace, not fast enough or completely enough in my mind, but using combinations of photography with data visualization, with video, with audio. And I think there are some excellent work being done. I mean, just take a look at the Reuters story, for example, on the Ganges that was awarded a prize here. It's a fantastic combination of cartography and data and images and text, maybe missing some video elements. Maybe they were there, I didn't notice them. But I think that's the sort of storytelling that is likely to be more effective in years to come. The other thing I would say, and I know it's been talked a lot about, which is the notion of Instagram stories and the combination of various visual and other elements, audio, video, photos, text, emojis, etc. I think that's hugely effective. When I look on Instagram at the Instagram stories that media organizations are producing, some of them are better than others, but I find that they're a little bit staid and a little bit conventional. When I look at the Instagram stories that I see from sort of ordinary people, I find those often to be much more exciting. And so how do you combine journalism with innovative and exciting and playful storytelling that can help engage an audience? And how, perhaps more importantly, do we apply the technology that allows Instagram stories to be created? How do we migrate that away from those proprietary platforms and into the websites and apps of news outlets? I think there's a lot of work and a lot of opportunity to be done there.
Would you, I mean, a photographer for so many years would agree with the statement that photography is often too negative?
I think it has been in the past. Perhaps there's been a tendency to focus on the negative. I don't think that that's limited to photography. I think that the news media in general for many years has focused on bad news with the notion that good news didn't sell. I think what solutions journalism, for example, is doing is interesting and effective in that it's exploring some of the deeper societal causes and effects around the news and getting deeper into how people might be affected by the news. I think that's tremendously important. The question then becomes, how do you adapt that approach to make it more visual? And how do you do that in an innovative way as opposed to using photography in isolation? In other words, how do we continue to be at the vanguard of changing the language of journalism, changing the language of visual journalism? Because like any language, these languages are changing all the time. You know, we don't speak Elizabethan English anymore. Well, why should we tell stories in a format that in many places hasn't really changed since the 1960s or the 1970s? So I think there are opportunities. I think from my perspective, the secret to fully realizing them is to identify and engage with multi-skilled journalists who can do more than one thing. Traditionally, photographers took photos, reporters wrote stories, videographers gathered video, radio reporters gathered audio, and those were sort of mono-skilled professions in journalism. I'm seeing a tremendous surge, at least in the classes that I teach, the photojournalism classes that I teach, a tremendous surge in people's ability to do more than one thing. So I'm seeing young photographers or aspiring photographers coming into the workplace who can write very well, who can photograph very well, who can shoot and edit video, and can handle audio. And those, to my mind, are the people who stand the best chance of success professionally, and more importantly, will set the tone and the direction of future journalism, which is likely, as we see technology shifting rapidly, is likely to become much more capable of doing many more things than it can currently do.
Thank you. Kaiser, you've been investigating how solutions journalism can apply to visuals. Can you share your conclusions with us?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. Am I on? I can't hear. Thanks for having me, and thank everybody for coming. I'm an incoming assistant professor at the University of Georgia, where I'll teach photojournalism and graphic design. And a lot of my research is in visual communication and photojournalism, and also solutions journalism. And so myself and some other colleagues started looking at, well, we know that solutions journalism has this power from the story, but what about the pictures that are accompanying those stories? And so the first thing we did was work with the Story Tracker, which is a database the Solutions Journalism Network has of solution stories. And we looked at what are the pictures that are accompanying these stories. And we found that only 2/3 of them actually depicted the solution that was being talked about in the story. The other third were either generic photos or neutral photos or photos of the conflict that the solution was addressing. And so then that got us thinking, well, what's the effect on the audience when you have a solution story with a picture of the conflict or a picture of the problem that it's addressing? What happens to the audience? So we ran an experiment, and we found that indeed whenever you have a story with the solutions focus, but the photo is of a negative or a conflict focus, it causes the audience to come away with a more negative feeling. So it negates any of the positive emotions and you know, good things that could come from a solution story. And of course, whenever you had the congruent photo, a photo of the solution with the solution story, it had more positive emotion in the audience. Some researchers from the University of Oregon took it one step further and ran their own experiment across 3 different topics, and they found readers with a congruent solutions photo and solution story felt a lot more interest in the story, a lot more self-efficacy and behavioral intention, so they would actually do something about it. They felt that something could be done They combated the news fatigue and sort of the idea that everything is terrible by reading about the solution, seeing the solution that was happening, and feeling like, hey, I can contribute to this, I can be a part of this. And so from that, we see that when you have the solutions visual, it can create an even stronger connection to the audience with the story. And we know that. We know that we look at the photo first when we open up a story. And we know that the internet is a visual medium, and so we have to have these visuals along with the story. And so that, to me, kind of showed the importance of making sure that that visual connects to the story. And so going back to the database and the stories that we looked at, we went back and looked at, okay, well, what are the effective solutions visuals? And we found that the solutions visuals that connected the most of the story were those that were high in emotional appeal, high in positive emotion. They showed action and progress and what was being done about it. But we also found that they were usually being made by staff photographers or photographers that were connected to the organization. Whenever the story, or whenever the photos were more of the conflict, they were coming from external sources. They were stock photos, or they were file photos, or they were from just something more disconnected from the newsroom or from the story. And so the conclusion that we took away from that is that visuals need to be part of the conversation from the beginning. When you're planning your coverage, when you're working on a story, you have to be thinking from the visuals from the very beginning and not using it as an afterthought where, okay, we have this story, let's quickly dig up a file photo of the problem so that we have some art to run with it. And also attached to that, I think it's important, it shows the importance of involving the visual journalists in the conversation from the beginning and letting them be a part of the planning process instead of just somebody who gets a photo assignment and runs out and does it and then comes back, but they're also working with the reporter. And so to me, the big takeaway from all that and how we can take what we know about solutions journalism and solutions visuals and maybe apply it to the greater context is that, you know, it's not just about saying visual journalism is important, it's also about saying the visual journalists are important.
Thanks. Alicia, you are our example here. You wanted to share with us a case study from your organization.
Could I have the... Yes, it's kind of... hi, my name is Alicja Peszkowska and I come from Poland and I work in a news organization, journalism organization called Outriders, and because we are talking about visual storytelling, I actually have a video that introduces us, so it can just play in the background. But yeah, so what we do at Outriders, it's interesting because we are actually a very diverse team. So we have designers in the team and we have photographers in the team, and we do interactive storytelling mainly. We also have a very popular newsletter, but this is for the Polish audience only. But the interactive stories we do within an international newsroom, and we publish them in English as well. But so we are this diverse group of people, and we have been working with the Solutions Journalism Network, and we produced our first solutions journalism story last year, which, you know, we try to do in a way that we do all of our coverage, so more interactive. Yes, this is the story. It's called The Luggage. It provides a nice maybe bridge with the last session that was about climate change and tourism. And since we published it, I think last July, the idea was very simple. We wanted to talk about tourism in cities and the consequences of that, because the summer was coming and people were just about to travel. And what I like about it, this is a landing page, is that the landing page takes you directly to where you would start your journey as a tourist usually, so at the airport. Yeah, there are some, I'm basically trying to like show some examples. What was difficult was that like here there was just a picture of people in front of Sagrada Familia. So what we tried to do in this story was that we were trying to avoid showing the postcard-like shots that we are very used to from the cities we covered, and we wrote about Barcelona, but also Berlin and Dubrovnik and Krakow, Venice. So we try to avoid these shots that everyone is used to, and we try to take these normal shots, things you would see if you live there. So probably you see mainly the crowd in front of the pretty building, and not the building, because you're very used to that. And we also, of course, try to use maps and statistics, just because it is also a representation of reality. It's also mediated, maps and graphs, but it tends to be perceived as more neutral and providing more context. This is Rambla, very crowded. These are tourists taking picture in front of a Gaudi building. Yeah, this is Krakow already. But yeah, some of the graphics we used. So, to speak about the challenges of producing this story, which was also our first story. We are in the making of 2 next ones, but I'm also going to explain why it's happening so slowly. So this is a picture of Iceland. So we also wrote about Reykjavik in the material. And since we were not able to, we are also a small organization, so we did not travel everywhere to all of these destinations. We had to collaborate with people on the ground, which is also great, maybe because of the carbon footprint situation. But it was difficult to explain, our tactics for the material to all these other people, and which is usually also a problem in cross-border projects, right? It's just difficult to organize the work and to actually agree on the principles sometimes. So even though this picture does show the crowds, kind of, it is more aestheticized that we would like the picture in this material to be. And it's just speaking to the fact that it's nice to have someone who's thinking about the story visually, working on the story from the very beginning. People who are more qualified than me to talk about it talked about what happened to photography and what is going on in the world of attention politics, where everyone, and especially businesses, are in there for our attention, and it's very difficult to avoid this when you are reporting, which is what solutions journalism should be about. So you're not supposed to go for the shortcuts. You're not supposed to make an effect or impress or like play with the psychology of your reader. You're supposed to do some kind of a public service work, which is show an issue in a context that's going to help people be more informed about it and like also be, better citizens. And is also supposed to educate people. So it's hard to grab someone's attention for longer, and this is ultimately what you need to show the complexity of the problem. And I also think there is another problem with media literacy, which we know, we're not catching up with it quite in the education sector. But I think it's especially apparent when it comes to the visuals. So we're used to thinking about text as something that's, has to be thought first, like we think in words, but it's a little bit more mediated. We're used to constructing things with words a lot more. Like visual is something that we take for granted, and we think it's a one-to-one expression of reality, or this is what our readers think anyway. So it's more easy for them to be confused and cheated, but there actually is a language, right? There actually is a visual language and a visual culture that I think journalism should not just try to use for its advantage. It should participate in creating this language. So when it comes to solutions journalism, that's a last absurd shot I wanted to show you, but yeah, I think that's like, if you are working on a solutions journalism story, you need to know that as on the text layer, you just need to do a lot of research and you have to think about it. That's the same work that has to go into visuals, and it's difficult and it's time and resources consuming, which is why we have only made one so far, and it's our least interactive story. We have also converted it to the Insta Stories format. We do it with most of our interactives, and it was the most popular story for a long time. But yeah, I just think that it's difficult, but it's very important. So even though it might not bring you the biggest amount of clicks in a day at the beginning, I think it should have this intent of educating people to be more aware of what they're looking at and how it shapes what they're thinking. We should be taking this control away from we should be kind of setting the rules instead of just following what's happening. And this is the last absurd shot from street of Krakow, which I just wanted to show you for the end. And that's it. Thank you. That's it from me.
Thank you all. I think we have only 4 minutes left, so if you have any questions, please.
My name is Eric Meyer. I'm the editor-in-chief of the magazine Geo in Paris. Can you tell us a little bit more about what you're doing with the World Press Photo regarding the positive journalism or solution journalism? Because when I look at the pictures, I don't see that much solution-oriented journalism in the picture. So what's new with your association with the World Press Photo?
Well, the association with the World Press Photo is, the idea is to give the resources to the photographers that would like to cover stories in a different way, to travel. So it's mostly, I think we'll have 6 to 7 travel grants to a photographer to cover a story with a solutions angle. Yeah. And it will all be published in the New York Times. Is it what you're asking? Okay. But as I was saying, we are still pioneering and waiting for good examples, strong example of solution stories in photography.
Hi, I'm interested in what Santiago is saying about Insta stories being, when they're not done professionally, when it's actually just done by users, they tend to have a lot more emotional impact and the like. I wonder if you could just unpack a little bit of maybe some of the elements that you see in these Instagram stories that you feel we as publishers should be learning from.
From what I've seen on, mainstream news media use of Instagram stories, it tends to be a little conventional. There tends to be, a combination of stills with maybe some extended captions, and then you move into a little bit of video, a short clip. But I don't think it's as dense as some of the stories that I see from, my friends or people who I follow on Instagram, which are stories about their own personal lives. But there seems to be more of an emotional investment into those stories, probably because they are about their own personal lives. So how do you translate that excitement and investment into journalism? One of the things that's occurred to me, there has often or been a long-standing curiosity about the story behind the news, the story behind the photograph. And without making journalists into protagonists, I think there's a way of getting behind the story and presenting it in a way that resonates more with the viewer or the consumer. So I think it also has to do with the notion of whimsical storytelling and a little bit more lighthearted storytelling. I think sometimes journalism, for good reason often is maybe too serious and too dry. And I think there's a way of getting into what really is, for me, the essence of a lot of journalism, which is the commonality of the human condition, where despite the differences, societal, cultural, religious, whatever they might be, we have a lot more in common than we think often with people around the world. So how do we get into that commonality, which then potentially resonates more deeply with the viewer as opposed to just highlighting the differences? So I think there's a tremendous opportunity to explore all of those things. I wonder if there's a way to migrate those techniques away from the sort of proprietary Instagram platform and migrate it into the websites and apps of media organizations, especially those that are more dedicated to the business-to-consumer model as opposed to the business-to-business model.
Can I just say 2 things very quickly? I think there was a lot of workshops here about how to do it, so like how to have a face in front and how to focus on your reporters so that they build their own brand and then it's more relatable. But another side of this story is that obviously Facebook is interested in, the owner of Instagram is interested in having more like people-to-people content and not like, the content from the media outlets to be most prominent when we know why. So yeah, I think it's kind of two sides.
Is there any more question? Okay, let's have the last question.
Hi, thank you very much for this conversation. I'm continuing on Instagram stories. There are some solutions out there. AMP stories are one of them. It's an interesting medium that removes the story out of the platforms of social media. But the question is then, especially for outriders, for example, the investment of creating that entire project is huge. Is putting it on social media and available for 24 hours, is that worth it? So on one side, highly developed content is only available for 24 hours, and on the other side, what you mentioned is also, it needs to be more relatable. So should interesting content be then on, let's say, an AMP page and then more relatable content on the social media? What is the strategy that you see within, in stories in general?
So I think it makes sense for us. So we are like I think we are the only really Polish media organization that is experimenting with interactive storytelling. So I see our duty also in trying all of these things out. So this is like one, we need to really understand how it works and to inspire other people to use it. Secondly, there's this function, you can now do the highlights of your stories, so we then put them in the highlights and people rewatch them, so they don't really disappear. And thirdly, like we do publish them on the website first, so they're also like mobile responsive, but they're on the website, and then we just convert them using AMP as well.
Thank you so much. And if you want to continue the conversation, please, we can do it during lunch. So now we have the lunch time until 2:50. Please come back because there will be a lot of news literacy.